Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nitanamine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatharine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Okay, so we're continuing from our session last week on Wednesday, where we started speaking about the early days of Iskcon and how Prabhupada brought Krishna consciousness to the West. So our discussion, or our little examination of the early stages of Iskcon were in the 26 2nd Avenue storefront, the Matchless Gift storefront in New York. And the idea was to give everyone a chance to meditate on Srila Prabhupada and his glories before Vyasa Puja Day. And Vyasa Puja Day was yesterday, another glorious event, an auspicious event. And we all got to hear about the glories of Srila Prabhupada, and especially the different realizations devotees had by hearing of their offerings to Srila Prabhupada. So we'd like to thank all the devotees who brought in their, or sent in their offerings even to the last minute, because it's a very rare opportunity for us to be able to have our offerings read out to Prabhupada on Vyasa Puja Day, because generally most of the time we spend in hearing. But it's a great opportunity for us yesterday to have heard from other devotees and their realizations and how close they are to Srila Prabhupada and their gratitude for what Prabhupada has done for them. So last Wednesday we talked a bit about how Prabhupada left Calcutta, and on board the Jaladuta he experienced the heart attacks, he experienced seasickness, he experienced the joy of receiving his Bhagavatam books, and he actually mentions in one conversation that actually out in sea you either have turbulent waves, or when there's no turbulent waves, there's fog. And he's explaining that both are difficult for the boat. Both are dangerous situations for the person and people on the boat. In the same way we're suffering in material existence. So Prabhupada was very expert in presenting the philosophy in such a way we could understand with examples. And those examples himself would often be in relation to his own experiences in his pastimes. Like for example, he explained karma when devotees ask how is it that karma affects devotees after initiation. Isn't the spiritual master take away karma? And Prabhupada gives the example that, the fan, when you unplug the fan, it slowly comes to a halt. So in the same way, he gives examples in his lives about that. So without going further into that tangent, Prabhupada continued on the Jaladuta, and then he entered into Boston Pier on the 17th of September 1965. And he visited Butler, where the contact in Delhi he had met a year ago had told him that, Swamiji, because Prabhupada would go everywhere and anywhere, and he would distribute back to Godhead and his Bhagavatams. And he'd explain to people and get sympathizers to donate for him. And he'd explain that I'm going to the West because my spiritual master asked me to go to the West. And one Mr. Agarwal heard him and said, actually my son's in the West, he's in America. I'll get him to sponsor you. You just have to get your P form and all those passport and all the details ready, and then you'll be able to go. And Prabhupada thought, this is just a passing comment by just some sympathizer, some well-wishing friend. But then, I believe it's a couple of days or a couple of weeks later, Prabhupada suddenly received a sponsorship form saying that the person in America had agreed to sponsor him. So Prabhupada took that as his spiritual master's mercy, and he eventually ended up in Butler with Gopal and Sali Agarwal. After that, in October 18th, so that's a month later, he went to New York and he met Dr. Ramamurti Mishra. But unfortunately, staying with Dr. Mishra was a bit difficult, because Dr. Mishra was a Mayavadi. But that still didn't stop Prabhupada from being a very gracious personality, to the extent that Dr. Mishra openly said that he didn't accept what Prabhupada said, but he accepted Prabhupada as a friend, because at that time Dr. Mishra was suffering from so much health complications that Prabhupada would cook and feed him and bring him back to health. So then after that, Prabhupada, he was with Dr. Mishra for some time, preaching in the yoga classes. If you listen to the 6th chapter Bhagavad Gita classes in 1969, rather 1966, 1965, 66, you'll hear Prabhupada's talking about preaching in Dr. Mishra's place. In 1966, after he had established Iskcon, he again went up there with some of his disciples from the Lower East Side, the Bowery. So when he was staying in the Matchless Gift, they invited him back up again to Uptown, where Dr. Mishra was living. And you can actually hear a recording of that class Prabhupada gave there. So anyway, 1965, 18th October, he left Butler, went to Dr. Mishra's place. Then he got sent to a small office, because Dr. Mishra couldn't tolerate Prabhupada preaching about Krishna consciousness and defeating Mayavad philosophy. There, Prabhupada unfortunately experienced his typewriter and his tape recorder was stolen. So then he moved. And because he had made acquaintances and connections, one of the people he met, they said that he could come and visit and live in the loft. So his name was Harvey Cohen. He later became Haridas. So after a couple of months in New York, Prabhupada went to San Francisco, where Mukunda and Janaki set up the San Francisco Center, and there he initiates Harvey later on. But anyway, at this point in time, Harvey's loft, he was available, and one David Allen was living there. So Prabhupada thought he could make him a disciple. There Prabhupada started the first loft preaching programs, where he started cooking classes and Sanskrit classes. But unfortunately, this David Allen, he flipped out, went mad, and as you know, Prabhupada then left that place and he started off in the Matchless Gift storefront. And then we talked a bit about how Prabhupada, his preaching technique, how he preached to all the young students of the Lower East Side of the Bowery, and how he started bringing Krishna consciousness to the West. I was reading Satsvarup Maharaj's offering to Prabhupada this year, and Satsvarup Maharaj was actually glorifying how he was listening to Prabhupada's early classes, 1966, 1965, 1967 classes. And then he's explaining how Prabhupada was so bold and Prabhupada was uncompromising in the way he preached, to the extent that he would just directly tell everyone that Krishna is God. He wouldn't water it down, he wouldn't compromise nothing. And Maharaj was expressing his wonder and astonishment that Prabhupada was so straightforward and forthcoming. Prabhupada he gave Krishna consciousness in such a way that people could accept it, but never in any place Prabhupada didn't say that Krishna was the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He was very straightforward. He gave Krishna consciousness the way people can accept it, but he didn't water it down. So Prabhupada, following that mood, he also was very personal with everyone that came. So he would always dedicate his time to teaching and preaching, to the extent that sometimes he would just keep speaking to the people and he would fall asleep while speaking. And then all the boys that came to visit Prabhupada during those, they would ask intimate questions. What was India like? Who's your spiritual master? All these more personal questions. And Prabhupada would explain in detail, to the extent that sometimes Prabhupada would lie down and he would fall asleep, and they would slowly tiptoe out, and they would leave, and then to come back again the next morning at 6 a.m., where Prabhupada would start with Samsara Dava prayers, and then he would chant with the boys, and then he would read from Bhagavad Gita. Sometimes they would spend 1.5 to 2 hours just on 3 to 4 verses of Bhagavad Gita, because they'd be sharing realizations and everything. And slowly, gradually, they all started taking up services. So then you have Keith, you have Bruce, Harvey, Hayagriva Prabhu, I forgot his uninitiated name. Steve, Keith, then you'd have Umampati Maharaj, then you'd have Brahmananda Prabhu, and you'd have all of these boys that came from a particular place called Mott Street. And these boys would come to Prabhupada, and they would speak Roy or Roy Ram. And then after that you'd have a few more other disciples that would come. They weren't initiated at that time, but they would come and they would assist Prabhupada in different ways. Like, for example, Prabhupada got the 26th Avenue storefront. It was bare, and they came and visited Prabhupada once in a while to the classes, and suddenly they just developed this desire to decorate the storefront. So like that, slowly, Prabhupada kindled that small flame of desiring to serve Krishna. So gradually Prabhupada, just by his influence, by his association, they decided to take up more and more services. So then Hayagriva Prabhu started taking up more manuscripts to type, and he told Prabhupada that I can even edit them, I've got a degree and I'm a professor in the university, I can do it. And Prabhupada said, yes, make it nice, make it really good so that people will be able to read it nicely. So like this, they all started taking up services. But that wasn't all, because the reason why they started taking up services was the way Prabhupada took care of them. The way Prabhupada really cared for them. Like a simple pastime here is that Prabhupada, he taught particularly Keith, Kirtananda Maharaj, he taught him how to cook for himself. So he taught Keith how to cook just for one person, and Keith gradually mastered it to the extent Prabhupada started to tell him to cook for many people. And so it's mentioned here that they would have a very interesting sort of ritual or ceremony where all the boys would stand in the doorway, and when Keith was finishing cooking and everything, at one particular point in time, the last step in the whole cooking process was that he would boil the dal. A dal would be ready for the chaunts, and as Prabhupada had taught him, he would get a metal cup, fill it with ghee, and then he would throw in some cumin seeds and then some chilies, and when they became darkened, then he would immediately lift the lid of the dal, and then he would just throw it in with some tongs, throw the chaunts in and close it, and it would make a big bang sound. And as soon as it made a big bang sound, because of the chaunts, the hot oil coming in contact with the water, then it's mentioned here that they would all cheer. They'd all cheer, like as if, gold, something like that, He opened the tight cover slightly, dumped the boiling chaunts into the dal with a flick of his wrist, and immediately replaced the lid. Pow! The meeting of chaunts and dal created an explosion, which was greeted by cheers from the doorway, signifying that the cooking was now complete. So this is how they enjoyed Krishna consciousness, the Prasadam Lila. As soon as that was done, Prabhupada would just come out from the shower. He would be ready, he would have put tilak, everything, and everyone would bring all the prasada, the bhoga out to offer to Lord Chaitanya. Now the early altar in Prabhupada's room, Prabhupada would have, it was a kitchenette, a shower, a small room for himself where he would keep his trunk, and he would sit on a mat, so the trunk would act as his table, and he would just simply lie on the mat as his bed. And in the other room, the front, is where he would meet and greet guests, and he would eat with the boys and things like that. And in that front room, where as we'll hear today, how he ran the initiation ceremony and the first Iskcon initiation and marriage ceremonies. So anyway, the altar that Prabhupada had set up there was just a picture of Lord Chaitanya, a picture of Lord Krishna there. And it's mentioned there that, so it's just a picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates. That was the altar. Very simple altar, just a table, and then it would be a coffee table which held the picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, so it's Panchatattva picture. That's all it was there. And then they would just place how we make nice plate of offering for the Lord when we want to offer the bhoga, nice dal bowl, plate full of rice, cup and everything. The way they would offer is that they would just bring out the cooking utensils. They'd bring out one pot, they'd bring out the other pot, they'd bring a tray full of chapatis, and they'd just offer it to Lord Chaitanya and his associates. So Prabhupada would come and he would recite the prayers, the offering prayers. So he would chant the mantras, and all the disciples would pay obeisances along with Prabhupada while he was chanting the mantras. And it's mentioned here that they would they would follow him by bowing down knees and head to the floor, approximating the Bengali prayer one word at a time. So they would go with it. They'd make up something as they chant along with Prabhupada. So these are the early days of Iskcon, So they would just approximate as they went. So once they finished that, then it's mentioned here by Satsvarup Maharaj in his Lilamrita that Prabhupada then sat with his friends. So it's very interesting to note how the relationship between the boys and Prabhupada was that although Prabhupada was like in his 70s and these boys were like in their 20s, early and late 20s, still they were like some sort of friendly relationship they had with each other as friends. Slowly you'll see as you read Lilamrit how the whole dynamics changes in their relationship. The friendship remains there, but then that friendship comes with respect. Right now the boys don't understand Prabhupada's full position yet. They just see him as some Swamiji who's come to start up something new. And it seems pretty good, His food's pretty far out, it makes people go high. The chanting makes people high, So for them it's just like something new has happened in the lower east side of New York, near the Bowery. So Prabhupada, when he came, he at this particular point in time associated with the boys as a friend. And they would sit down and take prasad with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada would take prasad. But it's mentioned that he would take a banana and a bowl of hot milk. And he would get the banana and he'll press the banana on the edge of the bowl of hot milk. And that way slice the banana into his milk. So this is how Prabhupada would take his prasad along with his friends. Later on, when you hear about Shrutikirti Prabhu speaking about how he served Prabhupada, Prabhupada would sit very quietly. He's facing sometimes the wall, facing in a very quiet place, a secluded place, and he would simply just sit down and honor prasad very carefully. Right? Shrutikirti Prabhu says that he never was around Prabhupada so close when he was honoring prasad. He would be a distance away and he'd be facing Prabhupada's back. Because Prabhupada would be eating like that unless he's serving Prabhupada. Anyway, there's a lot of pastimes about Prabhupada and Prabhupada taking prasad. The most famous one is that in Mayapur, when Prabhupada is sitting down to take prasad, that the ants would immediately come and attack the plate. But the ants, Shrutikirti Prabhu writes, is that as if the ants knew the stature of Prabhupada, they wanted the Maha Prasad. So they waited around the edges of the plate for Prabhupada to finish the prasad before they took it. And the way Prabhupada used to take prasad was that there would be rice, dal, sabji, chapatis. But Prabhupada would first take chapati, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj also says this as well. Prabhupada would taste a little bit of everything. Chapati and all the different sabji and dal. Then after finishing chapatis, then he would go for his rice and his sabjis. And then sometimes there'd be some sweets and some other items there for Prabhupada to take. But Shrutikirti Prabhu says, as Prabhupada finished one item and went to the next, as if they saw the queue, they immediately charged in and started devouring that leftover Prabhupada had left. And he went to the next item. When he finished that, then they would come and charge and they'd eat that one as well. And slowly Prabhupada would finish taking prasad and he would leave. And Shrutikirti Prabhu would immediately come running with full anxiety and try to slowly brush off all the ants so he could distribute all the Mahaprasad to all the devotees. So this is how Prabhupada took prasad. Even in Vrindavan, when he was alone, he would cook, offer it to the Lord, and he'd quietly honor the prasad. But in this situation, Prabhupada's sitting there as if a friend and taking prasad with all of his associates then. And it's mentioned here, Prabhupada's open decree was that everyone should eat as much prasadam as possible. And that created such a humorous and jovial mood, like a family mood for all the boys to sit down and take with Prabhupada some prasad. And they would eat with great gusto. And if Prabhupada saw someone not eating properly, he would say, why are you not eating? Take more prasad. And then, he mentions, when I was coming to this country, I was thinking, how will the Americans ever eat this food? And he's saying this, seeing all the boys in front of him just devour the prasadam. Rice, dal, chapati. Very simple. Rice, dal, chapati and some sabji. So now, Satsvarup Maharaj mentions that at that point in time, he thought that being spiritual means you should deny what you like the best. So Prabhupada would personally come and serve. Would you like some more? Would you like this some more? So he'd ask Prabhupada. Prabhupada would ask Steve, or Satsvarup Maharaj back then, that would you like some more sweet rice? And he thought, oh, I really like sweet rice, but I should deny it, because spiritual life means you should deny what you like the best. I'll just take some of the plain rice. But then Maharaj mentions here that actually, he mentions there that actually the sweet rice itself wasn't, rather the plain rice wasn't just plain rice. The plain rice was fancy yellow rice with fried cheese balls. So it was some sort of fried rice with some paneer in it. So for them, they enjoyed like anything. They really enjoyed. But some of the boys, they had already traveled to India, so they knew how to eat with their hands. So they were eating with their hands, and everyone else was practicing to eat with their hands. I don't know, for most of us who are brought up, eating hands is, you naturally eat. But when you bring someone to Krishna consciousness and they try to start eating with their hands, it's very, very funny to see how they'll pick up rice and they'll try to pick and hold on. And this is how Prabhupada enjoyed. He saw everyone taking prasad and everything. And also Prabhupada had a little fun here and there. So Prabhupada would serve them in this way, and they would then accept Prabhupada's mercy. But sometimes these boys, they would be so, because they're young and they're completely out of it to a certain extent, sometimes they left everything for Prabhupada to clean up at the end as well. Only a few people would stay back, or no one would stay back to help Prabhupada do it. So Prabhupada would do everything himself. Now, many days went like this, and Prabhupada, whenever he used to come out, a certain instance or certain circumstance, Satsuru Maharaj recounts, is that Prabhupada would come out of the bathroom, that he would be dressed, and he would be putting tilak. And as he put tilak, everyone would just stare at Prabhupada and see how he was doing it. How he's putting this tilak, and how he's making a partition in the center, and how he's holding the mirror very expertly and everything like that. And one particular conversation, Prabhupada, my Guru Maharaj used to put on tilak without a mirror. Devotee, did it come out neat? Prabhupada, neat or not neat, that does not matter. But then Prabhupada says, yes, it was also neat. So Prabhupada had this very nice conversation with his devotees, a very nice, sweet relationship he had with them. He would then do arti. He would offer incense to the picture of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Panchatattva, and he would ring the bell, offer it, and then he would offer it to everyone. And everyone would just sit there and look at Prabhupada and like, what is he doing? And then, because they didn't know, they would say here, none of the boys knew what he was doing, although he did it every evening, but it was a ceremony. It meant something. The boys began to call the ceremony bells. So what we call arti used to call it bells. So they say Swamiji is doing the bells. So after bells, every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, then the kirtan and class would happen. So Prabhupada, this is how he started Iskcon, with a couple of wild young boys, wild couple of Americans. It's mentioned here. At the tiny temple would be crowded with wild, unbrahminical, candid young Americans. So this is how Prabhupada started Iskcon. Now, okay, there's a little bit of time. This section of Lilamrit is very nice, because I'll come back to this later. It helps you understand the state of mind of every single follower of Prabhupada that was there with him, that later on came and took initiation from him. It's very interesting to see that, because you need to understand what they thought about initiation. I'll come to that. So here Prabhupada says that there was a particular person called Don. Sorry, Satsuru Maharaj mentions that there was a particular boy called Don that used to live in the storefront. And the way he used to speak very slowly, and he used to enunciate every single word. He would never use contractions. So we say don't, won't, can't, all of these things. He would say do not, cannot, will not. He would be very, very particular in the way he spoke, as if he wanted to destroy the way people were speaking, the slangs the young Americans were speaking back then. So he was quite a difficult character to deal with. In fact, Prabhupada's only rule was that people not take drugs or alcohol or anything within the storefront. They could come, they could stay, they could, stay as long as they want, they could live there, they could just perform little service, but no drugs. Nothing from outside should be brought in. But he would somehow or other sneak things in and take. At one particular point in time, this person was smoking, or he had been smoking marijuana in the storefront, and a newcomer came in. And he had told, but didn't Swamiji say you're not supposed to be taking drugs? or he didn't want anyone smoking here. And the boy denied. And he said that, no, I wasn't. And so then this newcomer immediately pulled out some of the marijuana from his pocket and said, why do you have this here? And then immediately Don, he got angry and he punched him in the face. And this came to Prabhupada actually. The boys there were boys around, they didn't know what to do, they were shocked. This guy just punched him in the face. What happened here? So then they didn't know what to do, but later on they took it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada, oh my God, Prabhupada was furious. He even said, he asked him, he hit you? He asked the boy, I will go down myself and kick him in the head. But then Prabhupada thought about it and said that Don should be asked to leave. But by the time they came down, Don had already left. When we perform, or when we practice, or rather when we come to preach Krishna consciousness, and especially when we want to cultivate people, we'll come across, we would have had experiences of these things, wherein one person we bring to Krishna consciousness, and another person we also bring to Krishna consciousness, or we see around us that there will be some sort of friction between them. And Prabhupada here seems like he's taking a partial stance. That actually here's Don, he's a fallen soul, he's struggling, he's come here, and here Prabhupada wants to kick him in the head. What kind of sadhu is this? But actually, Satsur Maharaj clarifies, if you continue listening, that at one particular time Prabhupada came down for a class, and Don appeared in the front door of the whole class. Now you have to understand, Don's position was that he was conditioned by his own activities, his own desires and addictions, but he was very favorable to Prabhupada, that he was a well-wisher, so to speak, that he would just come to storefront, take prasad, attend the kirtans, whatever. He would leave, and sometimes he would just bring back money for Prabhupada and just give everything he got to Prabhupada, because he felt that, I should help this Swami. So Don's mood was like that, but he had his own addictions and attachments. Excuse me. So in this particular point in time, Don appeared in the front door, and Prabhupada felt great compassion and concern that he wanted to call Don in and accept him again. But he read this, but his first concern was for Iskcon. Ask him, Prabhupada requested Roy, who sat nearby. If he has marijuana, then he cannot come in. Our society. Prabhupada was like an anxious father, afraid for the life of his infant Iskcon. Roy went to the door and told Don that he would have to give up his drugs if he entered, and Don walked away. So you can understand from this, actually Don comes back a bit later, so you don't have to worry so much about what happened to Don. But here, Prabhupada's very careful on his preaching movement. He was compassionate, but he wasn't lacking in intelligence. He wasn't just overly sentimental about it. He knew when to do what. He was extremely expert and intelligent. Another one, Raphael, another boy. And this Raphael wasn't really interested in spiritual discipline whatsoever. He was a tall young man, straight, brown hair, and he was just aloof, casual. And one day Prabhupada's door lock broke, and Prabhupada had told him, Swamiji had told Raphael to fix it. But Raphael, he said, yeah, I'll fix it. But then he ended up just sitting in the front, just reading some poems. And he would just wander around town doing whatever he liked. So one day he just dropped by Prabhupada's, Swamiji's apartment. And when he had dropped by, he opened the lockless door and he just walked in. At that time Prabhupada had a little conversation with his disciples, or with his associates at that time, some other boys. And he just suddenly walked in, and this is what he says. As for me, he said, I do not know what's happening. I do not know whether a brass band is playing or what the heck is going on. He just came in, and on a trip, he just started speaking nonsense. Right? What do you think you would do in that situation? You just tell him to get out, right? Just don't disturb us, get out, or you just ignore him. This is what Prabhupada did. All the others there, they tensed up. They didn't know what to do, what was going to happen. Prabhupada just said, Raphael is very candid. And he just smiled. That's it. And he diffused the situation, and Raphael went on his way, and all the devotees just kept quiet. So Prabhupada, it's mentioned eventually Raphael fixed the lock. But then when Prabhupada was giving a class one day, suddenly Raphael just came forward, and he just said, I'm not meant to sit in the temple and chant on my beads. My father was a boxer. I'm meant to run on the beach and breathe in big breaths of air. And Raphael just kept going on and on and on, talking about things he would rather do than to take up Krishna consciousness. Then suddenly Prabhupada interrupted him in a loud voice. Then do it! Do it! Then Raphael shrank away, but he still stayed. So this is how Prabhupada was able to really break through all these conditionings and reach out to the soul that's actually suffering within material existence. So like this, all the associates is described how each one of them came with their own set of conditionings, and how Prabhupada smashed through each one of them very carefully and very lovingly brought them closer and closer to Krishna. Okay, so there's a lot more, but for the sake of time I'll leave it here. What eventually happens after this is that Prabhupada had a contact in the UN by the name of Mr. Bogart. And what happened was that this Mr. Bogart was arranging for a UN peace vigil. Because, at that particular point in time, America was going to war in Vietnam. They had decided to go to war. And they were conscripting all of the young men and women to go and fight in the war. So then, what happened was that Prabhupada got an invitation by this Mr. Bogart, and because Mr. Bogart was a acquaintance, he had printed all of the stationery. He had arranged all of the stationery for Iskcon, letterhead and everything, and Prabhupada also made him a trustee of Iskcon. So Prabhupada thought, for the sake of relationship and a good opportunity to preach Krishna consciousness, let's go. So the next morning they all went together, the boys with Prabhupada, and they felt, many places you read this, because Prabhupada was there, they felt confident, they felt protected, they felt, that what they're doing is right and what they're doing will be successful. Later on, when Prabhupada leaves to go to San Francisco, they'll all fall apart, in the sense they all feel very lost until Prabhupada comes back again. So that this dependence on pure devotee of Krishna is slowly manifesting within their heart, to the extent that their spiritual life is starting to grow slowly more and more. So they went in front of the UN building, and they sat there. And Prabhupada started chanting Hare Krishna loudly. And suddenly a policeman came forward and said, No. This is actually a silent peace vigil. You should just be peacefully praying here in front of. You shouldn't be doing any noise. So Prabhupada immediately just put the kartals down and just started chanting Hare Krishna on his beads. So at that time, the spokesperson of UN came forward and started speaking, and then invited Prabhupada to come and speak. And Prabhupada started speaking on Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita. He was mentioning how unless people take Krishna consciousness, God consciousness, then there's no chance of peace. So he quotes the peace formula. So then, this whole vigil went for 2 hours. The talk was maybe 15-20 minutes. The whole time Prabhupada just sat there and chanted japa with the boys. And then they came back. And Prabhupada was telling the boys that actually this is a good opportunity for us to preach Krishna consciousness. But Sasura Maharaj mentions there that Prabhupada, although that particular point in time Prabhupada wanted to preach Krishna consciousness by doing kartals, and he was sort of hampered in that way just chanting on his beads, the next day an article came out and it said, Sami Krishna, not even Swami, Sami Krishna. Sami Krishna leads peace vigil at UN. And they brought it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, that's all right. Sami Krishna, that's all right. Because the boys came, it doesn't even say W, it doesn't even say Swami, it just says Sami Krishna. But Prabhupada says, Sami Krishna, that's all right. Because that's a great publicity. That's exactly what Prabhupada wanted to do. He wanted to preach Krishna consciousness, and the best way was to get this publicity through newspaper. So people will understand, this is Krishna consciousness, this Swami is here. He's preaching Krishna consciousness. So in this way, Prabhupada slowly starts his Iskcon society. Now, just before we talk about the first initiation, there was a nice, rather a very tense situation that often happens, because you have to understand, Prabhupada is dealing with youth, unpredictable youth with crazy minds. Like we talked about last week, how suddenly some young hippie on LSD just randomly rocked up to Prabhupada's apartment and then started saying, right now I'm higher than you. Now I am God. And Prabhupada just folded his palms and he looked at him and said, I offer you my obeisances, now please leave. So you can understand Prabhupada knew how to deal with these people, but it's mentioned that for every sincere inquirer that came, hundreds came to challenge Prabhupada. And Prabhupada was undaunted. He would continue doing. Like for example, someone would come up to him and say, well, I'm a follower of Vedanta. He asked him, so do you know what Vedanta is? What is the first aphorism of Vedanta Sutra? And the other person would just go, I don't, not. They don't know how to respond to Prabhupada. Prabhupada would cut through that ignorance. He would cut through their pride. So Prabhupada was very expert in dealing with it, but that doesn't mean that Prabhupada didn't deal with it. It doesn't mean that Prabhupada just dealt with a few isolated cases. Prabhupada had to deal with a lot of it, because the whole place was run full of people who were exploring, trying to find out their own version of spirituality through drugs. So here, there was a particular situation here where one boy called Stanley, he was a young boy, but he got permission from his mother to stay with Prabhupada on the condition that Prabhupada would specifically take care of him. So Prabhupada would make sure he would take care of him. And he would make sure Stanley would eat. He would make sure when Stanley didn't eat, he would say, why are you not eating? You should eat more. And so he would do that to the extent that one time it became such a common thing that Stanley would take 10 chapatis on one sitting. Prabhupada would tell him, okay, that's enough. 10 chapatis, that's enough. Stay there. So then Prabhupada, he would mention that. Now, let's see if I can bring it up. Because this Stanley, unfortunately, due to association, he ended up going a bit wild, ended up going a bit crazy. But he stayed because of what Prabhupada did. Listen very carefully. So, while Prabhupada had gone to the UN Peace Vigil, that Mr. Bogart, what happened was that he invited Bogart to come and visit Prabhupada. And he thought that if he meets this Mr. Bogart from the UN office, that will be a great opportunity to expand the Iskcon movement. And so then he thought, okay, I'm going to cook upstairs with Keith. And he told Stanley, you stand down here and tell anyone that comes that they should not come upstairs, because we are busy preparing for this Mr. Bogart. So Stanley thought, okay, whatever, I'll just stand downstairs and I'll just do what Swamiji says. Stanley stationed himself downstairs in the storefront. A few of the boys were there, and he told them, you can't go up to see the Swami. No one can. So about 12 noon, Larry Bogart arrived, pale, elderly and well dressed by Lower East standards, and he said he wanted to meet Swami Bhaktivedanta. But unfortunately Stanley said, sorry. He said, Stanley informed him, his boyish face trying to impress the stranger with the seriousness of the order. This is a good example of, following the letter of the law but not following the spirit of the law. So here, this Stanley says, the Swami is busy now. He said no one can see him. But the very same person who's supposed to see Prabhupada has come, and he said you can't see him. So then he waited. This Mr. Bogart waited. There was no chair there, but this Stanley came and gave him a foldable chair, and he sat there. 10 minutes went, half an hour went. It was a hot day, no air conditioner nor fan. And you have this senior person sitting, senior in age as well, sitting there. Respectable person, just coming to the very bad part of town, and he's just sitting there waiting to meet the Swami Bhaktivedanta. He waits. Then after an hour, Mr. Bogart says, can I see the Swami now? And Stanley says, Stanley assured him that he could not. And Mr. Bogart left in a huff. So then upstairs, Swamiji became anxious, wondering why Mr. Bogart had not arrived. Finally, he sent Keith downstairs, and Stanley told him about the man whom he had turned away. What? Keith exploded. But that was... Within moments, Swamiji heard of what had happened. He became furious. He came down to the storefront. You fool! You silly fool! He turned and angrily rebuked everyone in the room, but mostly Stanley. No one had ever seen the Swami so angry. Then Swamiji walked away in disgust and returned to his apartment. So, we need to understand also, when we read these pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there's always this understanding we need to have, that when the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna, performs activities, he is not affected by material modes of nature. So when the Lord displays his anger, it's of a transcendental nature. It's not that he's contaminated by the modes of passion. So in the same way, we're reading about Srila Prabhupada, hearing about his pastimes, but we need to understand Prabhupada's position as the pure devotee, the Senapati Bhakta of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So Prabhupada, as a pure devotee, is not affected by the modes of nature. And Bhakti Chara Maharaj gives this example later on in Prabhupada's pastimes in one European country when the initiation ceremony is supposed to happen. When he got there and there were news crews recording everything, Bhakti Chara Maharaj says that when he got there, it was a whole sham. It was shambles. There wasn't anything prepared properly. Prabhupada said, where's the fruit, where's the flower, where are the beads? Nothing was arranged properly. To the extent that, something that happened here in Sydney as well. Prabhupada asked, where's the fruit? They went and gave Prabhupada some chopped fruit. As if Prabhupada was hungry. Prabhupada saying, where's the fruit? Oh, Prabhupada must be hungry. Let's go give him some chopped fruit. But actually the fruit's for the yagya and decorating the yagya. So then Prabhupada was getting furious and he was just one after the other. Even people who were trained was making these schoolboy mistakes. So then Prabhupada, he decided to use his fury, his anger to teach his disciples so that they'll never make the mistake again. And so Prabhupada was angry, yelling at them, do this, do that. At that point in time, one newcomer, he was like a hippie with long hair and everything, and he had heard from Prabhupada's disciples that you shouldn't be angry, you should be very peaceful, you should just chant Hare Krishna. So then when he saw Prabhupada being angry, he just told, Swamiji, you shouldn't be angry, you should chant Hare Krishna. And Prabhupada immediately just what did you think Prabhupada would do? He'd yell at that guy, you don't know who you are, I'm founder Acharya. Prabhupada put his hand in his bead bag and he started chanting japa silently. Very quietly. Some guy came off the street and he's instructing Prabhupada. Because he didn't understand Prabhupada's mood. And Prabhupada knew if there's one person that he's going to misunderstand everything, Prabhupada knew what to do. So in the same way, the anger Prabhupada showing here is not the anger of someone who's frustrated with his desires. Prabhupada showing his anger because the opportunity to expand Krishna consciousness was hampered. And if he doesn't check that by showing his anger and displeasure and correcting the mistake, then they'll continuously make that mistake and Iskcon won't expand. Krishna consciousness won't go around the world. So then Prabhupada, Stanley stays, and it's mentioned here that he had problems, therefore his mother had requested Prabhupada to take care of him. So then he would just space out, he would just stand there in the storefront, just looking out in the distance, just completely off his head. He would just stare blankly into the distance for many, many hours on end. So then one time, Prabhupada, he was sitting in his room, and this Stanley just comes in and sits down in front of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada stops what he's doing and says, yes. And Stanley says, may I have $50? And Prabhupada says, why? At that time, Prabhupada was the treasurer. He would hold the money. If anyone wanted anything, they would come to Prabhupada. Even if they wanted 25 cents, they have to come to Prabhupada and explain why they wanted 25 cents. And Prabhupada would give them, and Prabhupada would let them do what they wanted to do and make sure that they purchased exactly what they want. Any change came back because every single cent was important in Krishna's service. So then Stanley replies to Prabhupada, I want to purchase some gasoline and set myself on fire. Prior to this, Stanley had been going around talking about suicidal thoughts with all of the other boys in the storefront. So he was slowly losing his mind. So how did Prabhupada deal with the situation? Prabhupada saw Chuck at the doorway and told him to call Bruce at once. Bruce came quickly up and sat with Prabhupada and Stanley. Prabhupada told Bruce, whom he had recently appointed to handle petty cash, to give Stanley $50. And he had Stanley repeat why he wanted the money. But Swamiji, Bruce protested, we don't have that much money. There, you see Stanley? Prabhupada spoke very calmly. Bruce says we don't have the money. Then they phoned Stanley's mother. Later Prabhupada said that because Stanley had asked for $50 for gasoline, which actually only cost 35 cents, he could therefore understand Stanley was crazy. So this is what Prabhupada had to deal with during the early days. It wasn't so easy. So when we hear Prabhupada say that he had to walk through fire to set up Iskcon, yeah, he had to walk through fire. It was so difficult. But for Prabhupada, he pushed on because his mood was that he was there as a representative of Lord Krishna, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he was there to give Krishna consciousness to the West under the order of his spiritual master. So one day, Keith was cooking in the kitchen and Prabhupada was observing him standing next to him near the stove. And Keith just stops and looks at Prabhupada and says, "Can I become your disciple, Swamiji?" And Prabhupada says, "Why not? Your name will be Krishna Das." So then Prabhupada then thinks about it, and then he says that he announces that there will be an initiation. And then people asked, "What's initiation, Swamiji?" And Prabhupada said, "I will tell you later." So we were hearing recently how Ghanshyam Prabhu was saying that Prabhupada said we should not lie or we should not force people, but we can trick them to take up Krishna consciousness. Right? So the same way here, you'll see how Prabhupada is very expertly giving them Krishna consciousness. So here, after saying you will be initiated, he tells them to go buy beads and he teaches them how to string their own beads. So the whole day they just tie one end of the bead to a window or to a heater, and they would put the bead in, chant one Mahamantra, make a knot, and then they'll chant another mantra, and then make their beads like this. And it took them all day just to make their beads. So the next day was Janmashtami. And on Janmashtami they continued making their beads. And so Prabhupada was then saying, you will have to take vows. But of the vows, you have to promise to chant the prescribed number of rounds per day. So then the boys started thinking, oh, but actually in one place Prabhupada said 64 rounds. That the spiritual master says that only, his spiritual master said that you should chant 64 rounds. And another disciple, Wali, he was saying, Umapati Maharaj, he was saying, how can you chant 64 rounds and still work? It's not possible. How can you chant 64 rounds? It's not possible. So they went and spoke to Prabhupada, and then someone said, maybe you could chant 32. No, that's still too much. And so Prabhupada offered the rock bottom minimum, 16 rounds every single day. But hear this. He said the initiates would be taking vows, but he didn't say all the vows. He just said the prescribed number of rounds. So he gave them what little they need to hear. And so they rocked up the next day to the initiation. The next day was Prabhupada's Vyas Puja. On Prabhupada's Vyas Puja was the first initiation in Iskcon. Keep in mind, Prabhupada had already initiated a disciple in Jhansi by the name of Acharya Prabhakar. But in the West, the first initiation was in this storefront, Matchless Gift, in 1966, September 9th, the day after Janmashtami. Now, this whole initiation ceremony is also another interesting situation. But before that, when he started talking about initiation, all the disciples, or all the prospective disciples started talking, what does it mean, initiation? What is all this initiation about? Somebody said, it's a standard practice in India, and you have to take him as a spiritual master. Another one said, spiritual master? I reckon he'd be a good spiritual master. Whatever it is, anyway. I mean, I like him. I like his teachings. So I guess he's already my spiritual master. I don't understand how that would change the situation. And the other one says, oh, neither do I. I guess it doesn't. I guess it's just some formality. So like this, they would have their own idea of initiation and everything, and they'd all speculate and have a little conversation between themselves. But they had faith in Prabhupada, so they went ahead with it. It's mentioned, people who are distant to Prabhupada would have, like you can understand, concentric circles. There were those boys and girls that were very close to Prabhupada, intimate. There were those who were a bit further away. And as they lived in different places further away from the storefront, they were that far distant from Prabhupada. Although they had come in contact with Prabhupada before. Some people had come in contact with Prabhupada in Dr. Mishra's place. Some people had come in contact when Prabhupada was living down in the Bowery, further down, where he had lived in Harvey's loft with David Allen. So here, everyone, they're not quite sure. Some people are fixed, some are not. Now, on Janmashtami day, Prabhupada gives an initiation, he gives a lecture, but he explains initiation. And he says, and now, at length, I will tell you what is meant by initiation. Initiation means that the spiritual master accepts the student and agrees to take charge. And the student accepts the spiritual master and agrees to worship him as God. As he paused, nobody spoke. Any questions? And then there was none. He got up and walked out. And the devotees were stunned. Because what they had heard from Prabhupada previously, for weeks he had stressed that when anyone claims to be God, that he should be considered a dog. So they were completely bewildered. Suddenly, my mind has been blown, Wally said. Everybody's mind's been blown, said Howard. Swamiji just dropped a bomb. So for them it was completely bewildering. Can you imagine? The same person telling you that, and other places mention that, I think Mukunda Maharaj mentions it, that Prabhupada's giving class, and then Prabhupada's just furiously chastising the Mayavadis, that the Mayavadis are rascals and they're fools and they're denying Krishna's person, but they're actually in Maya and their illusion. And then all the boys sitting there, they thought, oh man, what's happening? Who is this Mayavadi? And then one of them thought, oh, this Mayavadi they must be from India. They must have really caused some problem to Prabhupada. Swamiji. There must be some guy that really roughed up the Swamiji. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't have no idea what was happening. But here, you can see their innocence. But they were faithful to Prabhupada. They were sincere. They were attached to Prabhupada because of the relationship they had with Prabhupada. And how Prabhupada had become a very dear friend to them. And how Krishna from within the heart was cleaning them, was cleansing the heart. Mahaprabhu was giving that mercy. So they thought, let's go and ask Keith, because Keith became the closest to Prabhupada first. Keith's background was that his father was a Southern Baptist priest at a church. But he came to New York and he thought that let me, try out this whole hippie culture, something new. But he had gone to India with, Howard. He had gone to India with Hayagriva Prabhu before, and they had understood or learned a bit about the culture of India and spiritual master and so on and so forth. So here, at this point in time, Keith was in a hospital, and he heard everything, and then he told them, why don't you go and ask Prabhupada, your Swamiji yourself, before the initiation? And they thought, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Let's go and ask Prabhupada, Swamiji ourselves. So they went up. And then Howard asks, does what you told us this morning mean we are supposed to accept the spiritual master as God? That means he is due the same respect as God, being God's representative, Prabhupada replied calmly. Then he is not God? No, Prabhupada said. God is God, spiritual master is his representative. Therefore he is good as God because he can deliver God to the sincere disciple. Is that clear? It was. So they clarified it to Prabhupada. Very important step. Tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. So you can understand these boys were already following Gita, following Krishna's instruction. Of course the Lord would cleanse their heart. So anyway, Prabhupada, he set up everything for the initiation. Straight from the beginning that morning, he got dirt just outside in the garden. He brought the dirt. He found bricks. He brought the bricks, set up the bricks, put the dirt there, set up the yagya. He cooked. He had prepared everything. And then he invited all his prospective disciples to come and sit down. Excuse me. So when he invited them all to come and sit down, then Prabhupada starts the whole yagya ceremony. He does the achaman and he starts teaching everyone else how to do the achaman. And when they make a mistake, Prabhupada stops them and carefully teaches them how to do achaman. And so they do the achaman and they start chanting the Om Apavitro Pavitro Vavus. But I'll take a step back, I skipped something. The night before on Janmashtami, just at 11 p.m., what happened was that Prabhupada gathered all of his boys up, or the girls upstairs, and he started explaining to them about Janmashtami, the pastimes, and then they broke their fast at midnight, and Prabhupada was speaking to them about Krishna's Leela, how he was born, how he took birth or appeared in the material world. Then Prabhupada talked about the necessity of purification for spiritual advancement. Here this I've read before, and I remember making a note of it, and I read it again recently, and now preparing for this seminar I also read it. I think this is a very important point to remember. So I'll read this section and then I'll speak about it. It is not enough to merely chant holy words, he said. One must be pure inside and out. Chanting in purity brings spiritual advancement. The living entity becomes impure because he wants to enjoy material pleasure. But the impure can become pure by following Krishna, by doing all works for Krishna. So that's the first point. The first point is that when we talk about cleanliness, we don't talk about the external dirt of the body. That's one aspect, of course. But the main important aspect is cleansing the heart of the dirt. And what's the dirt in the heart? Material sense gratification. The desire to enjoy material pleasure. Now this sentence is the KO sentence, the knockout sentence. And it's a good meditation point. Beginners in Krishna consciousness have a tendency to relax their efforts in a short time. But to advance spiritually, you must resist this temptation and continuously increase your efforts and devotion. So it's very easy, I'm initiated, I'm chanting 16 rounds, that's it, I'm done. Or, I've done this, I've done that. And you rest on your laurels, so to speak. You take a step back and you relax. That's enough. I just do the bare minimum and continue going on. But Prabhupada says if you want to advance spiritually, you must resist this temptation and continuously increase your efforts and devotion. So I found this a very striking point, because everyone has the tendency to relax their effort. This is the material world. The modes of ignorance and passion run strong in Kali Yuga. So naturally everyone thinks about relaxing and going and taking a step down, retiring, so to speak. Retiring from their activities. As you'll read later on, actually, there's not much time, but later on in the next chapter it's mentioned, Prabhupada was 71, Prabhupada took 4 hours of sleep every day, Prabhupada dedicated his life and energy in preaching and making sure he protected his disciples and devotees in protecting Iskcon. But here it mentions that Prabhupada was always thinking about expanding Iskcon, expanding the Krishna consciousness movement. He never felt like, okay, it's established, it's set in, the matchless gifts storefront, that's enough, I'll retire now. Prabhupada's mood was not that, okay, this is established, now next. It needs to expand. What's next? It needs to more, increase. So Prabhupada was always on the ball, so to speak. He was always running to make sure that this Iskcon expanded more and more. And we see by example, what started here in the storefront expanded so much that in 11 years he traveled the world so many times that he was able to give Krishna consciousness to every single country in the world, at least every single continent in the world. Excuse me. So you can see Prabhupada's mood, Prabhupada's sense of urgency. But this first initiation is quite interesting. Prabhupada didn't request anyone to get shaved. Prabhupada didn't request any change of dress. And Prabhupada didn't he didn't get any Guru Dakshina either. Generally where the standard is that initiation is the time where the disciple takes shelter of the spiritual master and brings something for the spiritual master. Like we read actually, I think it was Upendra Prabhu, he came to Prabhupada in the beginning days and he got initiated and he thought, what should I give Prabhupada? I don't know what to give. And then he thought, the most precious thing I have is this blanket that I've had since I was as a baby, my most dear blanket. So I'll give that to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada got this, what will I do with this? So Prabhupada gets it, and you know what Prabhupada does with it? He makes it a seating place for people to come and sit down and take darshan and speak with him. So that idea of Guru Dakshina that wasn't even present within their mind. What to speak of Guru Dakshina? They just came for the initiation, attended, and they all left. Prabhupada did all the cleaning as well after the initiation. Can you imagine that? He's Vyas Puja, he's initiating them, he's taking their karma, and he's also cleaning up after their mess, after they leave. Anyway, that's Prabhupada's glories. Prabhupada didn't complain. Prabhupada just did it because he understood the mood and the mentality of the devotees at that time. So, anyway, so Prabhupada, he does the yagya. As he performs the yagya, he chants on everyone's beads, gives them initiation, gives them their new name. Like for example, Howard becomes Hayagriva, Wally becomes Umapati. I'll read the names here. There's 11 initiates. The first Iskcon initiation, 11 initiates. Howard became Hayagriva, Wally became Umapati, Bill became Ravindra Swarup, Carl became Karlapati, James became Jagannath, Mike became Mukunda, Jan became Janaki, Roy became Roy Ram, and Stanley became Striadish. Another Stanley and Janos. So the Stanley became Satyavrata, the second Stanley became Satyavrata, and Janos became Janadana. This Janadana, he establishes the Iskcon Canada later on. He becomes a very prominent disciple of Prabhupada. As with all of them, as we know, Roy Ram, he becomes the, he sets up the whole Back to Godhead magazine. Hayagriva becomes the editor, and so on and so forth. Mukunda Maharaj, Janaki, they all go to, set up the San Francisco Center. They go to England later on for Prabhupada's preaching. So anyway, 11 initiates, and this is all of their names. Someone like Satsarup Maharaj, Brahmananda Prabhu, Kirtananda Maharaj, they get initiated in Radhashtami. Because some weren't available, some were too early, some weren't ready, but then they get initiated 2 weeks later on Radhashtami. Okay, so that's pretty much the initiation. There are just small points mentioned here. They just sort of highlight the initiation and give it more taste, more enjoyment. You can relish it a bit more by reading Lilamrit. Like for example, Prabhupada, he would have the fire going, and then he would ask all the disciples to come and put their banana in the fire, and it would create so much smoke that some of the disciples, they started crying and they ran away because of the smoke in their eyes. Others stood there and they just stood and with tears in their eyes trying to understand what Prabhupada's doing. Someone tried to open the window and Prabhupada said, no, this smoke is good for you. Normal smoke is not. This smoke is good for you. Keep the window closed, it's fine. And so the whole place, the whole room was covered in dense smoke. Other smoke disturbs, but this kind of smoke does not. So Prabhupada, so why do you think Prabhupada kept the windows closed? It's mentioned here that Prabhupada says that he asked the windows to remain closed because one, the smoke is purifying, it's not disturbing smoke. But secondly, most of the smoke had to be contained in the apartment so the neighbors wouldn't complain. Because if they suddenly saw black smoke coming from the room, they go, whoa, something's not right, something's not good. Anyway, so then Prabhupada, after that, he stands up and starts chanting Hare Krishna, and everyone starts following him. And Prabhupada says later on, there was so much smoke that I thought they might have to call the fire brigade. But Prabhupada was happy because that's the first step of Iskcon's expansion. Now Iskcon had disciples. The next day he calls Mukunda Maharaj, or Mukunda at that time, and Janaki, and got them married. And then again I mentioned a fortnight later, on Radhashtami day, he initiated a few more disciples. There are a few incidents in between, but I guess we're over time now. So that's how Prabhupada celebrated his first Vyas Puja in the West. This is how the first Vyas Puja happened. Later on we hear about how in, I believe it's in Tokyo, there was that big blunder when Prabhupada had his Vyas Puja. A junior disciple was offering the arti. There was no flowers. When Prabhupada says, where's the pushpa? Some disciple thought, oh, Prabhupada wants pushpa rice. So he went to the kitchen and started cooking pushpa rice. When he did for the pushpanjali, he didn't offer flower to Prabhupada. He said, where's the pushpa? Oh, Prabhupada wants pushpa rice. He went to the kitchen and started cooking. So in that incident, Prabhupada, he calls for Tamal Krishna Maharaj and chastises him. Weren't you there when I did it for my spiritual master? What's happening with this? To the extent that Tamal Krishna Maharaj felt that his spiritual life was going to end. And so then Tamal Krishna Maharaj begged Prabhupada, please give us another opportunity. So the next day, the day after Vyas Puja, they had a proper Vyas Puja celebration for Prabhupada. That's how Prabhupada set the standard, right? Well, how did the first Vyas Puja happen? He set up an initiation that he had to clean, and he had to feed, he had to cook, he had to feed, and he had to clean himself. The next day was a marriage that he cooked, he fed, and he had to clean himself. Of course, a few disciples were there to help him, but he did majority of the work himself. So this is how Prabhupada started Iskcon. Prabhupada dedicated a lot of his energy and time. And many times we hear about Prabhupada's later pastimes in Iskcon, how Prabhupada, he guided disciples from a distance, sometimes or directly by telling them what to do. But you can see here Prabhupada, whatever he did in the beginning, he would always share that with his disciples later on. He would tell his disciples to go, he would tell them, oh, one man is enough to start a center. They just need to learn how to cook, how to cook, chant, and give class. That's it. They can start a center anywhere. I have done it by my personal example. Now you can all do it. So Prabhupada was very particular in that sense, that Prabhupada did it himself, he taught by example, and he also encouraged his disciples to follow in that way. But now it's come to the extent that Prabhupada has preached so much that it's very easy for us to take up Krishna consciousness. So we can meditate on these pastimes, on how Prabhupada set up Iskcon for our benefit so that we can practice Krishna consciousness in the association of devotees. But more importantly, it's an opportunity, an oasis to bring people to Krishna consciousness. The temple is the base so that we can go out and fight a war against Maya. So, a few points I try to mention and highlight in this two-part seminar on the early days of Iskcon. Just wanted to emphasize or to highlight this point. Prabhupada really engaged all of his energy in setting up Iskcon, so that when we hear about how Prabhupada shed buckets of blood, tears and sweat to set up Iskcon, just by reading it you can understand how much Prabhupada did and how much Prabhupada has done all of the work. We just simply have to take what Prabhupada has given us and repeat, and we can also meet with success and bring more and more devotees closer to Radha Gopinath's shelter, or rather bring all these devotees or more conditioned souls to Radha Gopinath's shelter. So I'll end here. Is there any comments or questions or anything people like to share? No? Okay, thank you very much for listening. Please forgive me for any of the offenses I've made while this seminar. And thank you very much again for listening. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan ki jai, Jai Nithai Gaur Premanande.